Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Thank you for joining us. And here's a look at some of the stories we're covering for you today. The country's economy is still reeling from the pandemic, and with inflation here, we speak to a member of the House's Committee on Financial Services to get his take on where things may be heading. Federal bureaucracy is at a modern-day high. A new report spotlights the massive expansion of the federal government and how this impacts everyday Americans. Internal documents showed Instagram is harming young users' mental health. Senators on both sides of the aisle grilled a Facebook executive over the revelations. Consumers are likely to feel the effects of inflation when they go Christmas shopping this year. A new forecast from Salesforce estimates retail prices will rise by as much as 20% this holiday season. And the U.S. retail industry will face an extra $233 billion in the cost of goods sold around Christmas season. Higher shipping costs, supply chain issues, and a shortage of workers are mostly to blame. Surging prices have been a key theme amid the economic recovery, rising faster than wages and eroding the purchasing power Americans once boasted about. Federal Reserve officials believe the current bout of inflation is temporary, though they have admitted it's been higher and lasted longer than they had expected. American workers who filed for unemployment have increased more than expected. The Labor Department says that 362,000 people filed for unemployment benefits last week. That's an increase of 11,000 from the previous week. With inflation in full force and no end in sight, we had a chance to sit down with member of the Financial Services Committee, Congressman Warren Davidson, to get his take. Congressman Warren Davidson, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Thank you. It's great to join you.
Now, Congressman, you are a member of the on the committee of the Financial Services Committee in the House. And recently, the Fed Chair Powell had said that inflation is going to last a little bit longer than he expected into next year. What are your thoughts on this, and what can be done to ease the situation?
Well, it's not a surprise to people on the committee. Frankly, I started calling that out after the first CARES package. So the first CARES package was meant to be a bridge for the fact that not really pandemic risk, political risk. Politicians closed the economy early in the spring of 2020. And of course, 15 days to slow the spreads turned into, much longer. And that first 2.3 trillion was meant to bridge that fact. I talked to a business owner who, was ordered not to have customers there. The customers were ordered not to go there. And for good measure, the police put a barricade to prevent people from going there. That's not pandemic risk, that's political risk. And so the money went out and it accomplished some important purposes for, the lack of regular organic GDP. But that since then, Congress has just continued to dump more money and more money on the problem.
Now, the United States economy has been quite close to the Chinese Communist Party's economy. How important, or is it important, do you think, to untether ourselves from China?
Look, out of high school, I enlisted in the Army. So enlisted in the infantry, I got to go to Germany and see people who experienced literally their first hours of freedom when the Berlin Wall fell. So I was over there before and after the end of communism in Berlin. And, subsequently I served in Ranger Regiment. I never thought I was going to go to China without, body armor and a rucksack full of ammo. So I got out, got into manufacturing. And since 2000, since the 90s, really since Bill Clinton era, negotiated the World Trade Organization deal, there really hasn't been a way to do business in lots of America's economy without it involving China. So you go back to 1970s when Nixon started working to open up China. The theory was that America was going to leverage our powerful economy to kind of westernize China. And to some extent, sure. They watch some of our movies. The NBA might love China more than America in some cases. China likes some of our cars and our food. But the Chinese Communist Party has used their economy to influence the world far more than the world has influenced China.
Now, you mentioned before that you were, in the military, you were in the Army, you went to West Point, you also went through Ranger School. I just want to ask you about Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller, who's recently been sent to the brig for being outspoken against some of the policies and decisions that have been made. What are your thoughts on this situation?
Look, it's a shame that Lieutenant Colonel Scheller is the only person being held accountable for the failures in Afghanistan. And why? Because he really expected leadership. Leadership would involve accountability. And historically, the military has been great at that. So if you look at, in 2011, when General Stanley McChrystal was leading Afghanistan, he and some of his staff had conversations with the Rolling Stone magazine reporter that were deemed inappropriate. He was relieved of command. He's no longer on active duty from that time going forward. That was talking to a reporter of an American magazine. General Milley is having those worse conversations with the Chinese Communist Party. He's still in slot.
Congressman Warren Davidson, thank you.
Thank you.
A Senate hearing yesterday highlighted the damage Instagram has been doing to the mental health of teenagers. This according to Facebook's own internal data. The Wall Street Journal reported internal documents showed Facebook was aware that its Instagram app harmed young users' mental health.
I want to be clear that this research is not a bombshell. It's not causal research. It's in fact just directional research that we use for product changes.
This research is a bombshell. How you can deny that Instagram isn't exploiting young users for its own profits.
Senators on both sides of the aisle accused Facebook of failing to be transparent. Facebook paused its plan to create an Instagram product for children under 13 earlier this week, after a dozen of states' attorneys general pushed back. On Wednesday at the Capitol, Virginia Congressman Bob Good introduced legislation to combat critical race theory, an ideology rooted in Marxist thought being taught in public schools throughout the country, oftentimes packaged and portrayed with other deceptive names. The congressman was heckled and shouted down by protesters, prompting Capitol Police to intervene. We spoke to the congressman shortly after his press conference to better understand the legislation he is putting forth. Now, Congressman, you were introducing a bill today, some legislation. It was called Defending the Students' Civil Rights Act, which is essentially a bill that goes against the critical race theory being taught in the school system. Can you first of all tell us what is critical race theory and what is your legislation aiming to do?
One of the most dangerous things right now is our country becoming divided on race in a manufactured way, meaning in many ways we've made great progress and we're further ahead than we've ever been in terms of positive race relations among regular folks. But you have an effort by the left trying to divide us on race, and one of their tools is critical race theory, which is viewing everything through a racist lens, saying that our race defines us, that we're responsible for the sins of our past, that our race determines whether or not we're a victim or whether or not we're an oppressor simply based on our race, that our race determines our future, and again, it just identifies everybody and everything through the lens of race.
Now, a lot of these Marxist ideas and policies that we see are disguised with clever language. I think in your presser you opened up by saying that, and they're appealing to the masses. How can Congress expose these deceptive ideas and educate the public?
I think there is a on-the-ground effort as well as a larger legislative effort. And what we can do from the legislative side is some of the bills. One bill we've already sponsored, which says that you can't mandate federal funding based on teaching critical race theory. And in this bill that says, hey, if you teach critical race theory, you're violating a person's civil rights, because if you're using federal funding in the public education system, then that is a violation of the rights that are protected under the Civil Rights Act. But also on the ground, we want to support parents and come alongside them. I have attended 8 or 9 school board meetings in my district in the last few weeks where I'm trying to encourage those parents to be engaged, to be involved, to hold their local school board accountable. I don't think we ought to legislate from D.C. on what is the curriculum that a local school should teach, but we ought to fight against allowing federal dollars to be used to bully school systems into teaching the wrong things like critical race theory.
Now, critical race theory is a Marxist ideology. Although they use deceptive terms, they didn't skew too far when they chose this name. Critical theory came from Marx.
That's right.
Now, when it comes to teaching the root of this, which is essentially Marxism, communism, whose responsibility is it to teach our children the horrors of communism?
Well, we want to teach a full and a complete history. You know, those who would attack us for being against critical race theory would say, hey, you're trying to deny history. You don't want to teach history. We want to teach everything about our history, the good and the bad. We learn from it, we improve, and we grow going forward. And we want to teach what communism is. You know, it's very concerning that in our country today that socialism, Marxism, communism is losing a lot of the stigma from what that means. The millions of people literally that have been slaughtered throughout history by communist regimes, the millions of people who are literally living under dangerous, oppressive regimes today because of that. So it is our responsibility to teach that in our school systems.
Now, are the people in your district, are they taking a stand? I mean, the Virginians, Loudoun County has been fighting this battle. What are you hearing on the ground in Virginia?
Yeah, we continue to hear from parents begging us to come to the school board meetings, asking for help in combating what's going on in their school systems. The silver lining of the past year and a half when schools were shut down and kids were learning from home is that parents were exposed more to what was being taught in schools as they're supervising their kids learning online, or their children who are at home are sharing with them what they're being taught. And so that is a great thing. Transparency and sunlight is a good thing. I actually advocate for cameras in the classroom. Parents ought to be able to watch at any time and see what's happening in their classroom. So we want to come alongside those parents and frankly also encourage school board members to stand in the gap. When there's wrong mandates coming from Washington or Richmond, in our case in Virginia, then the school board ought to stand in the gap between parents and children and the oppressive federal and state government and not follow the guidelines or the mandates that are given to them from the state and federal government.
Congressman Bob Good, thank you.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
How much are you paying for our federal government to operate? On average, American taxpayers spend about $1 billion per day on the federal workforce, and the government is only getting bigger. NTD's Melina Wisecup has the story.
The number of executive employees is at a modern-day high. There are currently over 2 million federal employees, footing the bill American taxpayers at $140 million per hour. This latest report by government watchdog group OpenTheBooks.com maps out how the government has expanded over the years, especially during the pandemic.
And Congress appropriated about $5 trillion for COVID aid and COVID relief. This blew out the executive agency payroll, because when you spend more, you do need more employees to get the money out the door. During the pandemic, Dr. Anthony Fauci made about $17,000 more than what he made in 2019. Fauci out-earns all of them. He out-earns the President of the United States.
And not only is the government taking up more from paychecks, but its regulations are seeping into personal lives more. For example, Congress right now is working to pass that $3.5 trillion budget bill, and in it, Democrats included a rule to increase fines companies would face if they violate Biden's new vaccine and testing mandates.
For each instance of non-compliance with OSHA regulation, they would make that $70,000. Rather than $70,000 on the willful and repeated violations, they would make that $700,000.
Also in the budget bill, Congress is working on a proposed rule for the IRS to monitor Americans' bank accounts, both business and personal accounts.
We have NTD's Melina Wisecup here with us to discuss. Quite an eye-opening report there, Melina. So this federal oversight group claimed to have detected sort of a strategy from the Biden administration to force companies to either comply with his vaccine and testing mandates or go bankrupt. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, Steve, so the Biden administration is really using OSHA as the vehicle to implement all this. Now, OSHA is a part of the labor industry that oversees and inspects workplaces. Now, the way the government watchdog organization explained to me how Biden made this possible is a three-step process. First, he made it possible for OSHA to enforce COVID regulations within the healthcare industry. Then step two, Biden's mandate last month, which requires federal workers to get vaccinated, and also companies with over 100 employees to either have their employees vaccinated or get tested, which brings us to step three, this tenfold increase in fines that could be placed on these companies if they violate that mandate that Biden announced last month. So Congress is working right now to make an tenfold increase in those fines up to $700,000, which of course would make it easier for companies to go bankrupt. Steve?
Now, this is in that budget bill that the Democrats are trying to pass. Now, we know this week the Democrats have faced some roadblocks here. What's the latest on this front?
Well, Steve, it really just depends on who you ask. If you ask progressives on the Hill, they are very confident that this budget bill will pass. Speaker Pelosi yesterday just told us that this bill will pass affirmatively. She 100% confident throwing her support behind that. But there's a catch here. In the Senate, they need 50 Democrat votes, all 50 Democrat votes, in order to pass it. But just again yesterday, Senator Joe Manchin, a moderate Democrat, came out and said he opposes that $3.5 trillion price tag, and he offered a much lower $1.5 trillion price tag. Now, Senator Joe Manchin also mentioned something interesting. He says he doesn't want to encourage an entitlement mentality. Let's take a look.
I believe in my heart that what we can do and what the needs we have right now and what we can afford to do without basically changing our whole society to an entitlement mentality.
Now, with him being such a crucial vote in the Senate for this bill, this really puts Biden's Build Back Better agenda in an uncertain position. Steve?
Thanks for that, Melina. And coming up, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy this week is revamping Republicans' calls to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable. He proposes ideas on how Americans can take a stand. With more and more employees applying for religious exemptions to the COVID-19 vaccines, employers are facing scrutiny over how they decide which person's deeply held religious beliefs are sincere and how they deem others not, raising serious concerns over discrimination. And with vaccine misinformation and disinformation coming from all directions, we sit down with Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson to discuss potential therapeutics and vaccine mandates. We'll have this and more in just a moment. Hello and welcome back. The pandemic has killed more than 700,000 Americans. This week, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy revamped his calls for Congress to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for allowing the virus to spread around the globe.
We should be able to have the ability for anyone who lost their lives to hold China accountable, be it in the courts, just as we did after 9/11. Thirdly, I think we should make sure that all the nations together should not reward China with the Olympics. So there are a number of things that we can do. We should also make sure that the funding of where our money goes, if it goes to a grant or somewhere else, for the idea of the studying of what was happening in China, make sure no money goes there ever again.
The minority leader calls this a China crisis that must be dealt with. Right now, congressional Republicans have a subcommittee investigating the origins of the CCP virus. And McCarthy's plan calls for all intelligence gathered surrounding the origins of the virus to be released to all nations. And a Chinese state-run biotech company tried to take advantage of the pandemic to get their hands on sensitive U.S. data, offering to build COVID-19 testing labs to 6 United States governors. The United States intelligence community convinced the governors to turn down those offers, but the CCP has already collected sensitive health data from people around the world, including data from U.S. healthcare patients. To reject these efforts and protect Americans' data, Representative Gallagher and Senator Tom Cotton this week urged the Biden administration to blacklist these Chinese biotech companies, including Beijing Genomics Institute. The congressman wrote in a letter to top Biden administration officials that at least 15 Chinese companies perform genomic sequencing for U.S. healthcare patients. That puts Americans' most sensitive health information, their DNA, at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. With vaccine mandate deadlines coming down on workers across the country, we had a chance to speak with Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin about the potential crisis this situation will bring. We also asked him why he thinks certain therapies to treat COVID, besides the vaccines, have been talked down. Here's what the senator had to say. Senator Ron Johnson, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Well, thank you for being here to cover Dr. Corey.
Absolutely. So on that note, why do you think it is that we have not heard more about in the way of prophylactics and therapeutics when it comes to managing and treating COVID-19?
That is the $64,000 question. I mean, I've got a bruise on my forehead, banging my head against the wall. I've been advocating for early treatment since literally April of 2020. The first time I heard the potential maybe hydroxychloroquine, I'm completely agnostic, by the way. There's literally a cornucopia of drugs I've heard about that different physicians, as they've practiced medicine, as they've used their off-label prescription rights, believe that it's helped their patients. And, you know, COVID's a complex disease.
Senator, I want to ask you about another issue. We could be facing a bit of what you would
potentially call a humanitarian crisis in the Northeast. New York, the state of New York, the healthcare workers there are reaching a deadline for the vaccine mandates. Boston, some of the major hospitals there, Massachusetts General Hospital, Partners, world-renowned hospital. There's a lot of healthcare workers, nurses, doctors that are going to be resigning or getting fired because they're not complying with these forced vaccinations, many of which may have natural immunity. It's a very little talked about crisis, really, because these are good, hardworking people. They're going to be left without a work.
Well, before the federal mandate, I've been cautioning America about this for quite some time because I have been advocating for early treatment. I've also been advocating for the vaccine injured. And so I've been talking to doctors and nurses. Some of them have been vaccine injured. They're treating people with vaccine injuries. They've had COVID. They were heroes. They treated COVID patients. They got COVID. They've recovered. They're looking at the studies showing natural immunity more effective than the vaccines. They don't need the vaccine. They see the injuries. They're treating the injuries.
It's not even on the table.
So we already have a severe healthcare worker shortage. Severe. I held a 3-hour roundtable today. One of the comments was from a nurse saying she's watched patients die in the ER because they didn't have the personnel to treat the people. They waited too long, and somebody died, a couple people died needlessly. They didn't have to. That's just one example. So we already have a crisis in terms of worker shortages in healthcare. This is going to exacerbate this by I don't know how many orders of magnitude. This is not just in the Northeast. This is going to be nationwide.
And especially we're going into the winter where, you know, typically things tend to surge. So to have a lack of healthcare professionals at this time could be even more disastrous.
Well, they were talking about traveling nurses. I mean, that just tells you right there you've got a problem when they're having to pay huge bonuses. You know, nurses are quitting their regular jobs and they're getting offered huge contracts to travel and fill in the gaps. Again, that's today before the mandates take effect. No, this is going to be an unmitigated disaster.
Senator Ron Johnson, thank you.
Thank you.
And Washington, D.C. is the latest metropolitan city to come under scrutiny over its vaccine mandates. In a statement, a group of Washington, D.C. firefighters say they are being bullied and harassed by the mayor over her skepticism for their request for an exemption of the vaccines based on their sincerely held religious beliefs. We had a chance to speak with a Washington, D.C. firefighter to better understand part of what's happening here.
Will Jones, Washington, D.C. firefighter, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Now, Will, you've been at the front lines of this battle, if you will, on the vaccination mandates in the city of Washington, D.C. You have about a quarter of the city's fire department. Last we checked, it was 419 that were looking for an exemption to the vaccine. Tell us, what is the current situation?
Yeah, I would say that number is that's the last number that was reported at the mayor's conference, and that reflects the percentage of people. You know, there's a significant amount of people that are not comfortable taking the vaccine at this time. And the question that we're posing to the mayor, to the council members, to the Department of Health is it safer to fire that many firefighters, fire hundreds of firefighters, or allow them to provide a negative test before assuming duty? Currently, we are providing negative tests before assuming duty, and so I understand 100% the concern that we don't want to any unvaccinated member. We don't want them transmitting that to vulnerable people. That's a legitimate concern. Testing negative before getting on duty takes care of that concern. If we fire hundreds of firefighters, that will endanger the city and affect public health in the city in terms of responses to fire.
Now, there's also a lot of firefighters who are seeking religious exemptions. Just recently, the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, came out and had some skepticism about these religious exemptions. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, we have been facing a lot of real pushback and harassment for the amount of religious exemptions that have been submitted by the fire department. One thing that we want to point out is part of the reason that we saw that many number of exemptions come from the fire department is because until last week, we were the only organization that had the testing option removed. And I would say also that our spiritual beliefs are very personal to us, especially serving on the front lines. Each year, more first responders lose their life to suicide than to line of duty deaths. And so for those of us that are working on the front lines where we're seeing traumatic events every time that we come in, our spiritual beliefs are something that helps sustain us as we're doing the work that we do. I know for myself, my spiritual beliefs are part of what gives me the courage and strength with the things that I face doing this job. And so to see that called into question, to see that criticized, is something that really is unfortunate, because that is something that helps us get through the difficult times and the things that we see every time we come into work.
Will Jones, good luck and thank you for your service and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Lawmakers of both Democratic and Republican parties took a timeout on Wednesday to participate in the annual congressional baseball game. The Republicans won 13-12, with Florida Congressman Greg Steube hitting an actual out-of-the-park home run to win the game. This year, the lawmakers have raised nearly $2 million for charity. President Joe Biden showed up. Biden mingled in both Democratic and Republican dugouts. This tradition began in 1909. Last year's game was canceled due to the pandemic. And that's all we have for the Capitol Report for you today. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Thank you for joining us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.